The moment I realized things had gone too far was when I felt Landon's hand linger just a second too long against mine. We were standing in the kitchen, surrounded by bags of flour, spilled sugar, and a few broken eggs. Christmas music played faintly in the background, and the warm, spicy smell of cinnamon filled the air. From the outside, it must have looked like any other family holiday moment. But it wasn't. Robert had left that morning on yet another business trip. He wouldn't be back until Christmas Eve, which left Landon and me alone in the house. I hadn't planned for us to spend the evening baking cookies together. It just happened. "I don't think this is how it's supposed to look," Landon said, holding up a lumpy mound of dough. His dark hair was a mess, and there was a streak of flour across his cheek. I couldn't help but laugh. "You were supposed to follow the recipe, not wing it." He grinned, leaning against the counter. "I'm more of a creative type. Recipes are too restrictive." "That's one way to put it," I said, rolling out another batch of dough. Landon was always like that, charming, easygoing, with a knack for making every moment feel like an adventure. It was one of the reasons he'd done so well at work. He had a natural talent for design, and his ideas were often the ones that made our game projects stand out. But outside of work, things felt complicated. I didn't know exactly when I'd started noticing him in a way I shouldn't. Maybe it was the way he laughed at my jokes, even when they weren't funny. Or the way he stayed late at the office to help me with projects, even when he didn't have to. Or the way he looked at me sometimes, like I was the only person in the room. At first, I'd brushed it off as harmless admiration. After all, I was his stepmother, married to his father. There was nothing more to it. But standing there in the kitchen, watching him roll up his sleeves and smirk at me like we were sharing some private joke, I felt my resolve slipping. "Here, let me show you how it's done," I said, stepping closer. Landon handed me the rolling pin, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was brief, but it sent a spark of heat through me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the dough in front of me. "You have to press evenly, like this," I said, demonstrating. He moved closer, leaning over my shoulder to watch. His chest brushed against my back, and I felt my breath catch. "Like this?" he asked, his voice low and warm. I swallowed hard. "Yeah, just like that." The air between us felt thick, charged with something unspoken. I could feel the heat of his body, the faint scent of his cologne, mixed with the cinnamon in the air. I told myself it was nothing. Just a moment, just a little too close. But then he reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine as I rolled the dough. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I should step away, make some excuse, do anything to break the tension. But I didn't. "Vanessa," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look at him, and the space between us disappeared. His eyes met mine, dark and searching, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. "We shouldn't," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his hand still on mine. "But it doesn't feel wrong." His words hung in the air, and I knew I should shut it down, put an end to whatever was happening before it went any further. But the truth was, I didn't want to. It wasn't just about the way he looked at me or the way he touched me. It was about how he made me feel, alive, seen, wanted. When he leaned in, I didn't stop him. His lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative, and my resolve crumbled. The kiss deepened, slow and searching, and I felt myself melting into him. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and for a moment, all the guilt and fear faded away. It wasn't until the timer on the oven beeped that we broke apart, breathless and wide-eyed. "We can't do this," I said, stepping back. "I know," he said, his voice steady, "but that doesn't change how I feel." My heart ached at his words. I wanted to tell him I felt the same, but I couldn't. Instead, I turned away, pretending to busy myself with the cookies. "Your dad will be home soon," I said, trying to sound casual. Landon didn't press the issue. He just nodded and helped me finish baking, the tension between us simmering just beneath the surface. Later that night, after Landon had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the glowing lights of the Christmas tree. What had I done? I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that wouldn't happen again. But deep down, I knew better. The kiss had been a spark, and now there was no putting out the fire. The days after that kiss were a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't seem to shake. Guilt, excitement, fear, They all churned inside me, twisting into a knot that tightened every time I saw Landon. We didn't talk about what happened in the kitchen, but the air between us was charged with unspoken tension. I threw myself into work, hoping the deadlines and meetings would distract me. But working with Landon every day only made things harder. It had all started weeks before the night in the kitchen, during one of those endless late nights at the office. The holiday project was in full swing, and Landon had been tasked with designing a new character for our Christmas-themed game. His sketches were brilliant, full of life and personality, and I found myself drawn to the way he poured himself into his work. "Vanessa, what do you think of this one?" he asked, holding up a concept sketch. I leaned over his desk, studying the drawing. The character was whimsical, full of quirky details that made it feel real. "It's perfect," I said, meaning it. He grinned, the kind of boyish smile that made my chest tighten. "Thanks. I wasn't sure about the color palette, but if you like it, I'll run with it." "It's great," I said, straightening up. "You have a real talent for this, you know." His smile faltered for a moment, and he looked at me with an intensity that made me feel like he was searching for something. "It means a lot, hearing that from you." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and walked back to my desk. But the way he looked at me stayed with me long after the conversation ended. A week later, the team was sent to a gaming conference in Chicago. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day trip: attend panels, showcase our game, and network with industry professionals. But, as always, things didn't go as planned. The first night, after a long day at the convention, the team decided to go out for drinks. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to stay in my hotel room and avoid the chaos, but Alyssa convinced me. "Come on, Vanessa," she said, linking her arm through mine. "You never let loose. One drink won't kill you." We ended up at a crowded bar near the convention center. The music was loud, the lights dim, and the energy in the room was electric. Landon sat across from me at the table, nursing a beer and laughing at something Alyssa said. I tried to focus on the conversation, but my eyes kept drifting to him. The way his smile lit up his face, the way he ran his fingers through his hair when he laughed, it was maddening. At some point, Alyssa and the others decided to hit the dance floor, leaving me and Landon alone at the table. "You don't dance?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Not my thing," I said, sipping my wine. "Me neither," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Too many people, too much noise." I laughed. "So why are you here?" He shrugged, his gaze steady on mine. "Because you are." My breath caught, and for a moment I couldn't think of anything to say. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. Before I could respond, he stood and held out his hand. "Come on, let's get out of here." We ended up at a quiet cafe a few blocks away, the kind of place that stayed open late and served coffee in mismatched mugs. "I needed a break from all that noise," he said as we sat down in a booth near the back. "Me too," I said, grateful for the change of pace. We talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing. He told me about his college days, how he got into game design, and his dreams of creating his own studio someday. I told him about my early career, how I worked my way up to creative director, and how much I loved what I did, even when it was stressful. "You're amazing, you know that?" he said, his voice soft. I laughed, shaking my head. "I'm just doing my job." "No," he said, leaning forward. "You're more than that. You're smart, talented, and, God, Vanessa, you're beautiful." His words caught me off guard, and I felt my cheeks flush. "Landon, I'm serious," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "You have no idea how much I admire you." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to brush it off, to tell him he was just being kind. But another part of me, the part I tried to ignore, wanted to believe him. Later that night, as we walked back to the hotel, the tension between us was palpable. The streets were quiet, the cold air biting against my skin. When we reached the hotel, I hesitated in the lobby, not ready to say goodnight. "Vanessa," he said, stepping closer. "I know this is complicated, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you." His words hit me like a freight train. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't tentative or hesitant. It was full of emotion, raw and desperate, like he'd been holding back for too long. I should have stopped him. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my hands tangling in his hair as weeks of tension and longing came rushing to the surface. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. "This can't happen," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. "But it already has." We didn't talk about it the next day, but everything had changed. The line between us had been crossed, and there was no going back. Back at the office, we tried to act like nothing had happened. But the stolen glances, the accidental touches, the unspoken tension, it was all there, simmering beneath the surface. And I knew it was only a matter of time before it all came to a head. By the time Christmas week rolled around, Landon and I had slipped into something I could no longer control. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something we'd ever sat down and discussed. But after that night in the kitchen and everything that had happened before it, a door had opened between us, one that neither of us wanted to close. It started with stolen moments at work. At first, they were innocent enough. He'd linger at my desk a little longer than necessary, or I'd find excuses to walk past his station. We'd exchange glances during meetings, quick and loaded with meaning. But those moments quickly escalated. One late afternoon, when most of the office had cleared out for the day, I found myself in the small storage room down the hall. I'd gone there to grab supplies for a meeting, but when I turned around, Landon was standing in the doorway. "Hey," he said, his voice low. I froze, the tension between us immediate and electrifying. "Landon, you can't." "I know," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. I needed to see you." His words sent a shiver down my spine. The room was small, barely big enough for the two of us, and the air felt heavy with everything we weren't saying. "You shouldn't be here," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Do you want me to go?" he asked, his eyes locked on mine. I couldn't answer. The rational part of me was screaming at him to leave, to put some distance between us, before we did something we couldn't take back. But the part of me that had been aching for him, the part that couldn't stop thinking about the way his lips felt on mine, wanted him to stay. When he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine, I didn't pull away. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered, his voice raw. Before I could respond, his lips were on mine. The kiss was desperate, hungry, and I found myself giving in, my hands tangling in his hair as weeks of tension erupted into something neither of us could control. The storage room became our secret. Over the next few weeks, we found excuses to slip away. 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. The risk of being caught only heightened the thrill, and I found myself craving those moments with him more than I wanted to admit. At home, things were more complicated. Robert was still busy with work, his attention fixed on conference calls and client meetings. He barely noticed when I stayed late at the office, brushing off my excuses with a distracted nod. But Landon was always there, a constant presence that I couldn't ignore. One night, when Robert was working late in his home office, I found Landon in the living room. He was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone, and when he looked up at me, something in his gaze made my breath catch. "You okay?" he asked, sitting up. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, just tired." "Come here," he said, patting the space next to him. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down. The couch felt too small, the space between us too close. "Long day?" he asked, his voice soft. "You could say that," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the TV, and the silence between us felt heavy, charged. "Vanessa," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look at him, and before I knew it, his lips were on mine. The kiss was slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the frantic desperation we'd shared in the storage room. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, the rest of the world fading away. It wasn't long before our affair spilled out of the office and into other parts of our lives. We started meeting in secret. His car, a quiet corner of the park, even a hotel room once when Robert was out of town. Every moment with him felt stolen, like we were living on borrowed time. The first time we went to the hotel, I nearly backed out. The guilt of what we were doing weighed heavily on me, but the moment I saw him waiting for me in the lobby, all my doubts melted away. The room was small but cozy, and the moment the door closed behind us, he pulled me into his arms. "I've been thinking about this all day," he said, his voice rough with need. "Me too," I admitted, my cheeks flushing. The hours we spent in that room were a blur of tangled sheets, whispered confessions, and stolen kisses. For the first time in years, I felt alive, like I was finally being seen, finally being wanted. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to hide what was happening. Alyssa, ever perceptive, started to notice the change in me. "You seem different lately," she said one afternoon as we grabbed coffee during a meeting break. "Different how?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "I don't know. Happier, maybe?" "Lighter," she said, studying me with a curious smile. "Whatever it is, keep doing it." Her words sent a pang of guilt through me. If only she knew. At the same time, Robert began to ask more questions. "You've been working late a lot lately," he said one evening over dinner. "Things have been busy," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Too busy to spend time with your family?" he asked, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. I forced a smile. "It's just temporary. Once the holiday project is finished, things will slow down." He didn't press the issue, but I could feel the tension growing between us. Despite the risks, I couldn't bring myself to end things with Landon. Every time I thought about walking away, the thought of losing him felt unbearable. I knew what we were doing was wrong. I knew the fallout would be catastrophic if anyone found out. But when I was with him, none of that seemed to matter. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living. And I wasn't ready to let that go. The weeks that followed were a balancing act that tested every ounce of my composure. On the surface, I maintained the facade of a dutiful wife, a focused creative director, and a stepmother who had everything under control. But underneath, my life was a chaotic mess. Landon and I were playing a dangerous game, and it was only a matter of time before the cracks began to show. It started with the close calls. One night, Robert came home earlier than expected. I just stepped out of Landon's room, my hair still tousled and my heart racing, when I heard the front door slam shut. "Vanessa," Robert called, his voice carrying through the hallway. I froze, my mind scrambling for an excuse. "In here?" I called back, darting into the kitchen and grabbing a dish towel as if I'd been cleaning. Robert walked in, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, and gave me a suspicious look. "What are you doing?" "Just tidying up," I said, forcing a smile. "You're home early." "The meeting wrapped up ahead of schedule," he said, setting his briefcase on the counter. His eyes lingered on me for a moment, and I felt like I was standing under a spotlight. "You okay?" he asked, his tone curious but guarded. "Of course," I said, turning back to the counter to hide the flush creeping up my neck. "Why wouldn't I be?" He didn't answer, but I could feel his gaze on me. The office wasn't any easier. Jessica, always sharp and observant, had started to notice the subtle shifts in my behavior. "You've been awfully close to Landon lately," she remarked one afternoon as we prepared for a meeting. I kept my tone light, even as my stomach twisted into knots. "He's a valuable member of the team. We work well together." "Uh-huh," she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Just be careful, Vanessa. People talk." The implication in her words sent a chill down my spine. I laughed it off, but I knew Jessica wasn't the type to let things slide. Despite the growing tension, Landon and I couldn't stay away from each other. If anything, the risks only made our moments together more intense. One afternoon, we found ourselves alone in the conference room after a meeting. The blinds were drawn, and the soft hum of the projector filled the space as I packed up my notes. Landon lingered by the door, his eyes scanning the empty hallway, before he turned to me. "Close call with Jessica earlier," he said, a mischievous grin playing on his lips. "She's just nosy," I replied, though my voice betrayed my nerves. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine as he helped me gather the papers. "You're tense," he said softly. "Can you blame me?" I asked, glancing up at him. "No," he said, his gaze locking with mine. "But I don't regret any of it." The room suddenly felt too small, the air between us charged. Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips finding mine in a kiss that stole my breath. It was reckless, dangerous, but I couldn't bring myself to care. At home, things were unraveling faster than I could keep up. Robert had always been preoccupied with work, but now he seemed hyper-aware of my every move. "You've been different lately," he said one evening as we sat down to dinner. "Different how?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "I don't know," he said, studying me carefully. "Distracted, distant." I forced a laugh, shaking my head. Work's been stressful, that's all. He didn't look convinced, but he let it drop. Later that night, I found Landon in the kitchen, his expression tense as he leaned against the counter. He knows something's up, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Landon's jaw tightened. Does he know about us? No, I said quickly, but he's suspicious. He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. Maybe we should back off for a while. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't want to risk losing you, he said, his voice softening. But I don't want to hurt you either. The thought of pulling away from him felt unbearable. I knew he was right, but the idea of ending things made my chest ache. I can't, I said finally, my voice trembling. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. Neither can I. The turning point came a week later. Robert had been growing more suspicious, his questions becoming more pointed. One evening, he confronted me in the living room, his voice sharp and demanding. Are you having an affair? He asked bluntly. The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. What? No, I said, my voice shaking. Why would you even think that? You've been distant, distracted. You're always working late, always finding excuses to stay out of the house, he said, his tone laced with anger. Something's going on, Vanessa. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my voice steady. You're imagining things. Work's been busy, that's all. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue further. The tension reached its breaking point the next night. Robert was working late in his home office, and I found myself drawn to Landon's room. I knew it was reckless, but the need to see him, to be near him, was overwhelming. When I stepped inside, he looked up from his sketchpad, his expression softening when he saw me. Vanessa, he said, setting the pad aside. I closed the door behind me, my heart pounding. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice trembling. What do you mean? He asked, standing and crossing the room to me. This, I said, gesturing between us. It's too much. The lies, the risks. I can't keep pretending everything's fine. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment I thought he was going to argue, but instead, he reached out, pulling me into his arms. We'll figure it out, he said softly. I promise. The constant fear of being caught was suffocating, but my feelings for Landon kept pulling me back to him. I knew we were on borrowed time, that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. But I wasn't ready to let him go. Not yet. When it finally happened, it didn't come in the way I expected. I had always imagined the truth would come crashing down on me in one catastrophic moment. Robert bursting into a room at the wrong time, or Jessica piecing together the clues and spilling our secret in the office break room. But instead, it came as a slow unraveling, a series of cracks in the foundation of my carefully constructed life, until there was nothing left to hold it together. Robert's suspicions were growing by the day. He'd always been good at reading people, even if his job often kept him too busy to notice the little things. But now, every glance, every question, every comment seemed sharper, more probing, as if he were trying to catch me slipping. Who were you texting? He asked one evening as I stood in the kitchen, my phone still in my hand. No one, I said quickly, slipping the phone into my pocket. He raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. You've been glued to that thing lately. It's just work, I said, forcing a casual tone. The holiday project has everyone on edge. But his gaze lingered a moment too long before he nodded and walked away. That was the thing about Robert, he didn't explode. He didn't demand answers or throw accusations. He watched, he waited, and that made him even more dangerous. At the same time, things with Landon were becoming harder to contain. The more time we spent together, the harder it was to pretend nothing was happening. One evening, while Robert was out at a work dinner, Landon and I sat together in the living room. The glow of the Christmas tree lights cast a soft golden hue over the room, and the faint hum of holiday music played in the background. We can't keep doing this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and vulnerability. Why not? Because it's wrong, I said, my chest tightening. Because we're going to get caught. I don't care, he said, leaning closer. I love you, Vanessa. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. I know how complicated this is. I know what's at stake. But I can't pretend I don't feel this way about you. Tears welled up in my eyes. Landon, this isn't fair to you, or to anyone. It's not about fair, he said, his voice breaking. It's about what's real. That night, I lay awake in bed, Landon's words echoing in my mind. I loved him. There was no denying that anymore. But the guilt was suffocating, and the fear of what would happen if Robert found out was enough to make me feel like I was drowning. I didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, it happened. Robert came home earlier than usual, his face set in a grim expression. I was sitting at the dining table, going over notes for the next day's meeting, when he walked in and set his briefcase down with a thud. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. My stomach dropped. "What's going on?" He sat down across from me, his hands clasped tightly together. "I've been patient, Vanessa. I've tried to give you the benefit of the doubt, but I can't ignore this anymore." "Ignore what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The late nights, the excuses, the way you've been acting," he said, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not stupid." I swallowed hard, my mind racing for a way out. "Robert, you're imagining things. I've been busy with work, that's all." "Don't lie to me," he said sharply, his voice rising. "I've seen the way you look at him, the way he looks at you." My heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" "Landon," he said, his voice dripping with disgust. "Do you think I haven't noticed? The two of you whispering at dinner, the way you're always finding excuses to be alone together?" I opened my mouth to deny it, but the look on his face told me it was useless. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "It's not what you think," I began, but he cut me off. "How long?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. The truth spilled out before I could stop it. "A few months," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Robert stared at me, his face a mix of shock and fury. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and the silence was deafening. "You disgust me," he said finally, his voice cold and flat. Tears streamed down my face, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. "You've destroyed this family," he said, standing up and grabbing his briefcase. "I hope it was worth it." With that, he walked out the door, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence. I found Landon in his room later that night, his face pale and drawn. "He knows," I said, my voice shaking. He nodded, his jaw tight. "I figured." "What are we going to do?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. He reached out, pulling me into his arms. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "We always do." But the uncertainty in his voice told me he didn't believe it any more than I did. The fallout was swift and brutal. Robert moved out the next day, leaving behind only a terse note and a promise to contact his lawyer. At work, the tension between me and Landon was impossible to ignore. Jessica's knowing glances became sharper, her comments more pointed. "You might want to be careful," she said one afternoon as we crossed paths in the hallway. "People are starting to talk." The weight of her words pressed down on me like a stone. That night, Landon and I sat together in the living room, the glow of the Christmas tree casting long shadows across the walls. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice breaking. He nodded, his expression pained. "I know. I love you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But maybe loving each other isn't enough." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but deep down, I knew he was right. The weeks after Robert left were a blur. At first, I thought I'd feel relief. The secret was out, the lies were over, and the constant tension of hiding what Landon and I had been doing was gone. But the reality was far worse than I'd imagined. Robert hadn't just walked out on me. He'd walked out on our life. He left the house cold and empty, and the quiet felt deafening. The weight of what I'd done pressed on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every room in the house felt like a monument to the family I'd destroyed, and every glance from Landon reminded me of the impossible situation we'd created for ourselves. The fallout at work was just as bad. Jessica, always perceptive, had clearly pieced things together. She didn't say anything directly, at least not at first, but her demeanor shifted. The sharp edge in her comments turned into barely veiled accusations, and I could feel the whispers building around me. "Everything okay, Vanessa?" she asked one morning, her tone saccharine sweet. "Fine," I said, forcing a smile. She tilted her head, her gaze sharp. "Just making sure. You've seemed a little distracted lately." I wanted to snap at her, to tell her to mind her own business, but I knew that would only make things worse. The real blow came a few days later, during a meeting with the senior leadership team. Landon and I had been avoiding each other at work as much as possible, but the tension was still palpable. "I've heard some concerns about your team," one of the executives said, his eyes flicking between me and Landon. "Concerns?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "Just whispers," he said vaguely. "But it might be worth addressing before things get out of hand." The message was clear. People were talking, and it was only a matter of time before the rumors reached someone with the power to take action. At home, things were no better. Landon and I tried to carry on as if everything was normal, but the weight of what had happened hung over us like a storm cloud. One night, as we sat together in the living room, the silence between us felt unbearable. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," I said finally, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his expression pained. "Do what?" "This," I said, gesturing vaguely around the room, "pretending like everything's fine when it's not, living with this constant pressure." Landon nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. "I know, I feel it too." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The glow of the Christmas tree cast long shadows across the room, and the faint hum of holiday music played softly in the background. "I love you," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I love you too," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But maybe that's not enough." His eyes searched mine, and I could see the pain in them, the conflict. "What are you saying?" "I don't know," I said honestly. I don't know how to fix this." The breaking point came a few days later when Alyssa, my closest friend at work, confronted me. "I need to ask you something," she said, pulling me aside after a meeting. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. She hesitated, her expression conflicted. "Are you and Landon involved?" The question hit me like a freight train. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the look on her face told me it was useless. "Alyssa, She held up a hand, stopping me. "I don't need the details," she said quietly. "I just need to know if it's true." I nodded, my throat tightening. She let out a long sigh, shaking her head. "Vanessa, this is bad. You know that, right?" "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not gonna say anything," she said. "But people are already talking. If this gets out..." She trailed off, her expression grim. "I know," I repeated, tears welling in my eyes. That night, Landon and I sat together in his room, the weight of everything pressing down on us. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. He looked up at me, his expression guarded. "About what?" "About us," I said. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "What about us?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. This isn't sustainable, Landon. We're hurting everyone around us, and we're hurting ourselves." "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. "I love you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But maybe loving each other isn't enough." For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he reached out, taking my hand in his. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice breaking. "You're not," I said, my voice trembling. "But we need to stop, for both our sakes." The next morning, Landon packed his things and left. He didn't say where he was going, and I didn't ask. Watching him walk out the door was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but I knew it was the right thing. For weeks after he left, I felt like a ghost, drifting through my life without purpose. The house felt emptier than ever, and the silence was deafening. I tried to throw myself into work, but the whispers and rumors made it impossible to focus. Eventually, I handed in my resignation and walked away from the career I'd spent years building. Months later, I ran into Landon at a coffee shop downtown. He looked different. Older, more serious, but the moment our eyes met, it felt like no time had passed at all. "Vanessa," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "Hi," I said, my heart aching at the sight of him. We sat together for a while, catching up on everything we'd missed. He told me about his new job, his new apartment, his plans for the future. I told him about my new role at a smaller studio, how I was trying to rebuild my life. When it was time to leave, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "I'll always love you," he said quietly. "I'll always love you too," I replied, tears welling in my eyes. And then he walked away, leaving me with the bittersweet knowledge that some loves aren't meant to last, no matter how deeply they're felt. It happened in the kitchen on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was standing on my tiptoes, reaching for the top shelf of the cabinet, rearranging dishes that hadn't been touched in years. The faint hum of the radio filled the space, one of those easy listening stations I'd always kept on for company. It was supposed to be a simple task, one of the dozens I used to fill the quiet spaces in my day. Then Evan walked in. I didn't hear him at first. His steps were quiet, deliberate, the way they always were. I only noticed him when I turned to grab the next stack of plates and saw him leaning casually against the counter, his arms crossed, a small smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice warm, teasing. "I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly, my cheeks flushing as I realized how flustered I sounded. He stepped closer, reaching past me for the glass on the shelf above my head. The movement was smooth, natural, but it brought him so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the earthy warmth of the rain outside. "Here," he said, handing me the glass, his voice quieter now. "Thanks," I murmured, but my voice faltered, my breath catching as his hand brushed against mine. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air between us shifted, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. His eyes met mine, and the look in them made my chest tighten. It wasn't just a glance, it was searching, deliberate, like he was seeing something in me that I wasn't ready to acknowledge. I stepped back, breaking the moment, and turned quickly to set the glass on the counter. My heart was pounding, and I hated how obvious it felt. "You've been busy," he said, his tone easy as he leaned against the counter. "It keeps me out of trouble," I replied, forcing a smile. "Trouble?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "You don't strike me as the troublemaking type." I laughed, the sound more nervous than I intended. "Not anymore, at least." He didn't say anything, just watched me with that same faint smirk, his gaze steady in a way that made my pulse quicken. Evan had only been living with me for a month, but his presence in the house had already turned my carefully curated world upside down. When my husband, Richard, passed away 6 years ago, I'd spent the first few years drowning in the quiet. The house had been too big, too empty, and I'd filled it with routines and distractions, gardening, cooking, cleaning, anything to keep myself from thinking too much. It worked for a while, but then Evan came back. He'd called one evening out of the blue, his voice hesitant as he explained his situation. His tech job in Seattle had fallen through, his lease was up, and he needed a place to land for a while until he figured out his next steps. I could still remember the way he'd paused after asking, as though he were afraid I might say no. The next morning, the storm was gone, leaving the world outside fresh and quiet. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, glinting off the rain-soaked garden, and for a moment, everything felt strangely normal. But as I stood at the sink, rinsing my coffee cup, the weight of the night before settled heavily on me. My reflection in the window was as familiar as always, but there was something different about the woman staring back at me. Something softer, something unsure. I had crossed a line, and though I didn't regret it, I couldn't ignore the questions clawing at the edges of my mind. "What happens now?" I didn't hear him come into the room, but I felt his presence before I turned around. Evan was standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled. He looked younger in the morning light, less guarded, and for a moment I let myself just take him in. "Morning," he said softly, his voice careful. "Morning," I replied, setting the cup down and wiping my hands on a dish towel. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything we hadn't said yet. He stepped further into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were testing the waters. "Did you sleep?" he asked, his tone gentle. I nodded, though the truth was I wasn't sure how much of the night I'd actually spent sleeping. "Did you?" "Not much," he admitted, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He moved to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee before leaning against it, his gaze fixed on me. "Are you okay?" The question was simple, but it carried so much weight, and I felt my chest tighten under the pressure of it. "I don't know," I said honestly, my voice trembling slightly. He nodded as though he'd expected that answer. "That's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to figure everything out right now." His words were a relief, and I felt some of the tension ease from my shoulders. Last night, I began, but the words caught in my throat. Was real, he finished for me, his voice firm but kind. I looked up at him, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. It's not that simple, Evan. I know, he said, stepping closer. But it doesn't mean it wasn't real. He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine where it rested on the counter. The touch was soft, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I let my fingers curl around his, the warmth of his hand grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to know, he said gently. We'll figure it out. Together. His words made my chest ache, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. This is scary, I whispered. I know, he said, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand, but you don't have to do it alone. We stood there in the quiet, the sunlight streaming through the window, the sound of the world outside distant and muffled. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. A fragile, tentative kind of hope that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let someone in. I'm not asking for anything from you, he said after a moment, his voice breaking the silence. I just want you to know that I'm here. For as long as you'll let me be. His words stayed with me long after he left the room, echoing in my mind as I sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the garden. For years I'd told myself that I was fine on my own, that I didn't need anyone else. I'd built a life around that belief, one that was quiet and safe, but empty in ways I hadn't let myself acknowledge. But now, with Evan's words still lingering in the air, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew. Was it possible to let myself feel again? To let myself be vulnerable? The thought scared me, but it also filled me with something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. When I finally stood, the house was quiet, the weight of the night before still settling over it like a blanket. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if I was ready to face what came next. But as I looked out at the garden, the sunlight glinting off the rain-soaked leaves, I felt a small, tentative flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to let myself be happy. Maybe, just maybe, it was okay to take a chance. Of course I hadn't. He was family. Well, technically. I had married Richard when Evan was already 16, a tall, gangly teenager with a quick wit and a quiet charm. We'd gotten along easily enough, though he'd always kept a respectful distance, never quite letting me in. After Richard's death, we drifted even further apart, our occasional phone calls polite but distant. Now, seeing him as an adult, I could barely reconcile the boy I remembered with the man standing in front of me. He was confident in a way that felt effortless. His sharp features softened by an easy smile that seemed to disarm everyone he met. But there was a depth to him, a quiet vulnerability that he rarely let slip, and it tugged at something in me I couldn't explain. You've been quiet today, Evan said, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, startled by the observation. Have I? He nodded, his gaze steady. Yeah. Something on your mind? I hesitated, unsure how to answer. How could I explain the jumble of emotions his presence had stirred in me? The way he seemed to unravel years of carefully constructed solitude with nothing more than a smile. Just thinking about how much needs to be done around here, I said finally, deflecting. Let me know if you need help, he said, his voice warm but casual. Thanks, I replied, turning back to the cabinet to avoid his gaze. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me in the kitchen. The warmth in his voice, the subtle weight of his presence. It wasn't just about him, it was about what he represented. For years I'd told myself that I didn't need anyone else, that I was content with the life I'd built. But now, with Evan here, I wasn't so sure. Something had shifted, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but his face lingered in my mind, and for the first time in years, I felt the faint stirrings of something I thought I'd lost forever. The days that followed felt like walking through a maze, each turn more confusing than the last. Evan was everywhere. Not in an invasive way, but in a way that made it impossible to ignore him. I'd wake up to find him in the kitchen, sipping coffee at the table, his hair messy from sleep, and his bare feet tapping lightly against the floor. He always greeted me with the same easy smile, the kind that seemed to linger long after he'd left the room. Then there were the small things. The way he reached for plates while we set the table, his hand brushing against mine as if by accident. The quiet moments where he'd catch my eye and hold my gaze just a second too long. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into every look, every word. But the truth was he had unsettled something in me. Something I couldn't quite name. One afternoon, we found ourselves in the garden. The weather had cooled slightly, the crispness of early autumn creeping into the air. I was tending to the roses, carefully trimming away the dead leaves, when I heard his voice behind me. "Need a hand?" I turned to see him standing at the edge of the patio, his hands tucked into his pockets. He looked casual, relaxed, but there was a warmth in his eyes that made my pulse quicken. "I've got it," I said quickly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. He didn't listen. Instead, he stepped closer, crouching beside me and reaching for the pruning shears. "I'll do the heavy lifting," he said, his tone teasing. I sighed, handing them over. "You're stubborn, you know that?" "Must run in the family," he replied with a grin. We worked side by side in comfortable silence, the soft rustle of leaves and the chirp of birds filling the air. At one point I reached for a fallen rose, and our hands brushed against each other. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, and I pulled my hand back quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed. But he had. "Sorry," he said softly, his voice quiet but deliberate. "It's fine," I replied, turning back to the roses. But the moment lingered, the air between us charged with something unspoken. Later that evening, we ended up in the kitchen again, cleaning up after dinner. It had become something of a routine, me washing the dishes, him drying them. It was a small gesture, but one I appreciated more than I let on. "You don't have to help, you know," I said as I handed him a plate. "I know," he replied, his tone light, "but I like being useful." I smiled despite myself, focusing on the warm water running over my hands. "You've always been that way." "Maybe," he said, leaning against the counter as he dried the plate, "but I think you bring it out in me." I glanced at him, startled by the comment. His expression was unreadable, his gaze steady as he watched me. "Don't look so surprised," he said with a faint smile. "You're easy to be around." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I focused on the sink, scrubbing the same plate longer than necessary. "I mean it," he added, his voice softer now. "You make this place feel like home." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt my chest tighten. For years, I'd convinced myself that I was fine on my own, that the life I'd built was enough. But in that moment, hearing those words from him, I realized how much I'd been craving connection, even if I hadn't let myself admit it. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. The next day, the tension between us seemed to grow. It wasn't overt. Nothing had been said or done to cross any lines, but it was there, in the way he lingered in the doorway while I read on the couch, or the way his hand brushed against mine when we passed each other in the hall. "I didn't hear you come in," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "The storm woke me up," he replied, stepping further into the room. His gaze shifted to the matches in my hand, and his lips curved into a faint smile. "You okay?" "Just startled," I said, straightening. "Let me," he said, reaching out to take the matches from me. Our hands brushed as he did, his fingers grazing mine in a way that felt unreasonably intimate. I froze, the air between us suddenly thick with something unspoken. He struck the match, the sudden flare of light illuminating his face, and for a moment I was struck by how easily he seemed to fill the room. He lit the candle and set it on the counter, the warm glow casting soft shadows on the walls. "There," he said, his voice quiet. "Thanks," I murmured, but my words felt hollow. My chest was tight, my thoughts tangled in a way I couldn't untangle. "Storms like this always make the house feel different," he said, leaning against the counter. His tone was casual, but his eyes were on me, steady and watchful. "Different how?" I asked, grateful for the distraction. "Quieter," he said after a moment. "Like it's holding its breath." I nodded, understanding what he meant more than I wanted to admit. He didn't move, didn't say anything else, and the silence stretched between us until it felt almost unbearable. "Do you want some tea?" I asked, the words tumbling out too quickly. "Sure," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. I busied myself with the kettle, grateful for the excuse to put some distance between us. But even as I moved around the kitchen, I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unrelenting. When the tea was ready, I handed him a mug, careful not to let our hands touch. He accepted it with a quiet, "Thanks," his fingers brushing against mine anyway. We sat at the table, the candle flickering between us, the storm raging outside. He leaned back in his chair, his hands wrapped around the mug, his expression thoughtful. "You're quiet tonight," he said finally. "Just tired," I replied, though the words felt hollow. "You've been saying that a lot lately," he said, his tone soft but probing. I didn't know how to respond, so I took a sip of my tea, letting the warmth settle in my chest. "I worry about you, you know," he said after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. His words caught me off guard, and I looked up at him, startled by the seriousness in his tone. "Why?" "Because you don't let anyone in," he said simply. "You keep everything bottled up like you're afraid to let anyone see the real you." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew he was right. "You don't have to do that with me," he said, his gaze locked on mine. "You don't have to pretend." His words made my chest ache, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "It's not that simple," I said quietly. "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady. "Because I'm scared," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He nodded, his expression softening. "I know, but you don't have to be." His hand reached across the table, his fingers brushing lightly against mine. The gesture was simple, but it sent a shiver through me, and I felt my breath hitch. "Evan," I began, but my voice faltered. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything. I want you to know that I'm here. For you. No matter what." His words lingered in the air, and I felt the weight of them settle over me. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted finally, my voice trembling. "You don't have to know," he said, his thumb brushing lightly against the back of my hand. "You just have to let yourself feel it." The storm outside seemed to fade into the background, the sound of the rain and thunder drowned out by the pounding of my heart. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I let myself see the vulnerability in his eyes, the quiet sincerity in his voice. It scared me, but it also made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. "Can we just—" I trailed off, unsure of what I was even asking. "Take it one step at a time," he finished for me, his lips curving into a small, understanding smile. I nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. When he finally stood, his hand lingering on mine for just a moment before he turned to leave, I felt the air rush back into my lungs. "Good night, Marianne," he said softly, his voice warm and steady. "Good night," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As he disappeared down the hall, I stayed where I was, staring at the candle's flickering flame. My heart was still pounding, and my thoughts were still tangled. But for the first time in years, I felt a faint glimmer of hope. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep running from this. The morning after the storm brought a strange kind of clarity. The air outside was crisp and clean, the sunlight breaking through the lingering gray clouds to illuminate the garden. Inside, the house felt quieter than usual, as though it too were holding its breath. I spent most of the morning in the kitchen, my hands busy kneading dough for a loaf of bread. The rhythm of the task was soothing, and I focused on it with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, desperate for something to drown out the whirlwind of thoughts in my head. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Evan had looked at me the night before. The quiet sincerity in his eyes, the warmth in his voice, the gentle brush of his hand against mine. He didn't make an appearance until nearly noon, and when he did, it was with the same easy confidence that seemed to come so naturally to him. He walked into the kitchen barefoot, his hair slightly messy, wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but casual. "Morning," I replied, my tone brisk as I turned back to the counter. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed as he watched me. "You've been up early." "I had things to do," I said, avoiding his gaze. "Looks like you're doing everything," he said with a faint smile, nodding toward the counter where the dough sat. "You always do." His words struck a nerve, and I turned to face him, my hands still dusted with flour. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you take on too much," he said simply, his gaze steady. "You're always trying to do everything yourself." "Someone has to," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Why does it always have to be you? He asked, stepping into the room. I didn't have an answer for that, so I turned back to the dough, pressing my hands into it with more force than necessary. You don't have to do it all alone, he said softly, his voice closer now. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt my chest tighten. I'm used to it, I said finally, my voice quieter now. That doesn't mean it's right, he replied. I froze, my hands stilling against the dough as his words sank in. He was close now, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, and when I turned to look at him, the intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to keep shutting people out. The vulnerability in his voice broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, the words tumbled out. You don't understand, I said, my voice trembling. I can't let myself feel, he finished for me, his tone gentle but insistent. I nodded, my chest tight with the weight of everything I'd been holding back. You don't have to be afraid, he said, his hand reaching out to rest lightly on my arm. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, and I felt my defenses begin to crumble. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the tension between us thick and unspoken. I don't know how to do this, I admitted, my voice barely audible. You don't have to figure it all out right now, he said softly. Just let yourself feel it. That's all I'm asking. His words were a lifeline, pulling me toward something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Evan, I began, but my voice faltered as he stepped closer, his hand sliding down to clasp mine. It's okay, he said, his thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles. We can take it slow. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the oven timer going off, the sharp beep cutting through the quiet. I stepped back quickly, breaking the connection, and turned to pull the tray of bread from the oven. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was still standing there, his expression unreadable. Thank you, I said quietly, though I wasn't sure what I was thanking him for. He smiled faintly, his eyes soft. Anytime. That evening, the tension between us reached its peak. We were sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in each of our hands, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. The conversation had started light, small talk about the weather, his plans for the week, but it didn't stay that way for long. You've been distant today, he said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. I'm not distant, I replied, though the words felt hollow even to me. He raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint smile. You're a terrible liar, Marianne. I sighed, setting my glass on the coffee table. It's just a lot to process, I admitted. I know, he said softly, his voice laced with understanding. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he met my gaze. You don't have to have all the answers, he said. But you have to stop running from this. This? I asked, my voice trembling. Us, he said simply. The word hung in the air, and I felt my breath catch. There's no us, I said quickly, shaking my head. There could be, he replied, his voice steady. I looked away, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. It's not that simple, I whispered. It doesn't have to be, he said, his hand reaching out to brush lightly against mine. It just has to be real. The sincerity in his voice, the quiet intensity in his eyes, made my resolve falter, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. Evan, It's okay, he said softly, his hand closing gently around mine. We'll figure it out together. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his words echoed in my mind. We'll figure it out together. For the first time in years, the thought didn't scare me. It was late that night when it finally happened, the moment I'd been running from for weeks. The storm that had passed earlier seemed to have left something charged in the air, and though the house was quiet, my mind wouldn't stop racing. I was in the kitchen again, leaning against the counter with a glass of water, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. The day had been heavy, too many words left unsaid, too many moments where the tension between us had felt too much to bear. And though I'd tried to ignore it, to push it down, it lingered, pressing against my chest with every passing hour. I didn't hear him at first. He moved so quietly, his steps barely audible against the wooden floor. When I turned, he was standing in the doorway, his hair mussed, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You're still up?" he said softly, his voice cutting through the stillness. "I couldn't sleep," I replied, setting the glass down on the counter. He stepped into the room, the faint scent of rain still clinging to him. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, and yet there was something about him, something unguarded, almost vulnerable, that made my chest tighten. "Me neither," he said, leaning against the counter opposite me. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us thick and unspoken. I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unrelenting, and though I told myself to look away, I couldn't. "What's keeping you up?" he asked finally, his voice low. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "Just a lot on my mind," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Is it about me?" he asked, his tone gentle but direct. The question hit me like a wave, and I felt my breath catch. I didn't know how to answer, didn't know how to put into words the mess of emotions swirling inside me. "Evan, I began, but the words faltered. "It's okay," he said softly, stepping closer. "You don't have to say anything, He paused, his gaze searching mine, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I just need you to know that I care about you. More than I probably should, and I'm not going to pretend that I don't." His confession hung in the air, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "This is complicated," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his tone steady, "but that doesn't mean it's wrong." I shook my head, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. "You're my stepson, Evan. This isn't supposed to happen." "I'm not your son," he said quietly, his voice firm but gentle. "Not really. And even if I was, that wouldn't change how I feel about you." His words broke something in me, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "You don't have to know," he said, his hand reaching out to brush lightly against my cheek. His touch was warm, grounding, and I felt myself leaning into it before I could stop myself. "I'm scared," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I know," he said softly, his hand sliding down to cup my face. "But you don't have to be, not with me." His words made my chest ache, and before I could think, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. The kiss was tentative at first, hesitant and searching, but it quickly deepened, his arms wrapping around me as though he were afraid to let go. His hands slid to the small of my back, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him. The warmth of his touch chasing away the fear and doubt that had been weighing me down for so long. When we pulled apart, our foreheads rested against each other, our breaths mingling in the quiet. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "If this isn't what you want, just say the word and I'll walk away." I looked at him, my chest tight with a mix of fear and longing. "I don't want you to stop," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His lips found mine again, more confident this time, and I felt his hands slide up to cradle my face, his touch both firm and reverent. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an unraveling, a release of everything we'd been holding back. He guided me toward the couch, his movements slow and deliberate, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself fall into the moment, into him, into the warmth and security of his embrace. His hands moved with quiet reverence, exploring the curves of my body in a way that made me feel cherished, wanted, alive. My own hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping tightly as the intensity of the moment threatened to overwhelm me. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice breaking through the haze. "Yes," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mix of nerves and desire. His lips found mine again, and for the first time in years, I let myself surrender completely. It wasn't just about the physical connection, it was the way he looked at me, his gaze filled with an intensity that made my chest ache. It was the way he whispered my name, soft and reverent, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. And when it was over, when we lay tangled together on the couch, the faint glow of the candlelight casting soft shadows across our skin, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Hope. "Are you okay?" he asked again, his voice softer this time. "I think so," I said, my head resting against his chest. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his arms tightening around me. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "I'm here for as long as you'll let me be." His words made my chest ache, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. "This is scary," I admitted, my voice barely audible. I know, he said gently, but you don't have to do it alone. As the storm outside began to fade, the thunder growing distant, I lay there in his arms, the sound of his heartbeat steady beneath my ear. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was enough. And for now, that was all I needed.